reiterate that point about the essays, exegesis, and so on. Firstly, there is no absolutely set model that you have to use. Okay, whatever model of exegesis you develop has to be transparent as to where you're coming from, how you're addressing the primary methodological issues, and so on. And I think, and probably so if I recall, without looking it up again right now, in the subject outline, there are some specific requirements which are to be make sure you include this, include that, whatever. Again, in big picture things, the quoting of the biblical text, do that as much as you need to, but just don't count it as part of your word count. So allow for that in your word count. So it's really if it's a 2,000 word essay, say, depending on which stream you're in, then it's 2,000 words, not counting the biblical text that you're going to be quoting, because it's really, we want to see what you're doing with it, not simply leaving all the text out or cutting it down. The other question which Heather and I just got into a conversation about, which I think is actually very interesting. Heather was commenting that as she reads, in this case Isaiah 55, she's reading it, as it turns out, through her eyes as an avid gardener. Okay, so as she reads the text, she's noticing things in there which are evoking for her connections with other parts of the biblical text, as well as with her own experience as a gardener. Now, and the question was, is that valid to kind of include that, because she can't find any other commentaries apparently written by Old Testament scholars who are gardeners, so they're not making those connections. Well, that's great. I mean, that's for me no different from a student who might be of a totally different ethnicity and social background, like a former refugee from some other part of the world, and they bring their experience of migration, dislocation, reconnecting in a new community, and they read the book of Ruth and they go, wow, this is my story. Okay. Now the balance, of course, is how do you stop the personal, speculative, subjective stuff from just running amok like a weed, and how much do you kind of say that's a really good insight, I don't want to lose that dimension of what I'm doing. And one of the ways of doing it is just to identify that early in the essay. So Heather would include a sentence somewhere maybe in the introduction, maybe when she gets to the verse by verse commentary, where she'll just say, reading this text through my perspective as a gardener, I've noticed some features of the text which don't seem to have been commented on in the secondary literature, but I will include those in my discussion, whatever. And who knows? And that is also actually pushing your writing more towards the HD end of the scale, because you're not simply gathering like a hunter and gatherer, gathering the stuff and plonking on the page, shove it onto Moodle. Okay, done that. Okay, that's a pass, and that's fine. But once you start to work with the text and critique it and play with it, and once you start introducing original perspectives which are relevant and pertinent and actually allow you and others to engage with the text in extra ways, that's pushing it more towards the high distinction end on that particular criterion. Okay. So it is biblical exegesis is sort of like art appreciation. It is not an objective exercise. You should certainly include some of your own perspectives and affective dimensions into the writing. Now, I don't want a warm, huggy essay about how nice God makes you feel when you read Psalm 23 or something, but if that has been your experience, it may inform how you interpret that psalm, and that can be noted and worked with at an appropriate level. So it's perfectly okay to speak in the first person, and of course your personal discourse has to be connected with the larger academic discourse. In this kind of subject, we're not working with it in the original text and so on. For that kind of thing, you depend on the commentaries and the translations, but you are also adept readers who are engaging with the text and bring your own life experience and so on into it. So feel free, and that makes it much more interesting for me, and that's always good for your marks.
I just want to clarify about footnotes. they're included in the word limit?
No. Not unless you write a second essay in the footnotes. So, I mean, a rough, ballpark thing. This is... okay, so suppose the essay was a 2,000 word essay. That means you've basically got 20 paragraphs to work with. Okay, because you're going to have around, on average, 80 to 100 words per paragraph, sometimes a bit more, but ballpark, you're going to have about 20 paragraphs. Or you're going to have around 300 words on a page if you're using Times New Roman, 12-point font, double line spacing with reasonable margins. There'll be roughly 300 words to a page. Okay, so a 2,000 word essay is about 7 pages long, or it's about 20 paragraphs long. Again, not whole page paragraphs, but there should be one idea to a paragraph. These are just all basic essay writing 101 type stuff, but a paragraph should have one idea, which you might state, introduce, critique, evaluate, move on to the next idea, and you select and arrange the paragraphs to make an argument, not simply to bring in the dead bodies and lie them on the kitchen floor. You're actually doing something with the material, and there should be an appropriate number of references that you've consulted. 1 or 2 people got into grief with this last essay because they only had, say, 2 titles in their bibliography. No matter how good they are, that's really not enough reading into the subject, because part of this is to demonstrate that you've read into the relevant literature, but then that you can think for yourself, informed by that discussion. So there has to be a reasonable number of, and it's not like 6 or 8, but it's more than 2, and it's not 26. I mean, it's reasonable number. So I wouldn't expect the bibliography to be longer than a page when it's all formatted and printed. I mean, it might be, but normally wouldn't be. And little things like it's not correct style to put a URL, a web address in a bibliography. You can mention them in footnotes and endnotes, but you don't put them into a bibliography. Okay, and you don't put the Bible into a bibliography. Okay, now these are, what I'm quoting are the style guides for the Society of Biblical Literature, Handbook of Style, Supplement for Students. Okay, so these are the normal professional requirements of academic writing in biblical studies. And we don't all have to become pedantic about that, but I have, because I publish in that field, so I'll become more alert to doing the right thing.
Just with referencing, in-text referencing, you noted on mine having page numbers, but the APA 6th edition I have here says it's only page numbers for direct quotations. So
yeah, depends whether you... this is why a lot of theology lecturers don't like APA, because we actually want to know that you have actually opened the book and you can tell us what page the idea comes from, rather than scan the library shelf. Now that's the issue with APA. The minimalist scale would be, you just say Smith 1923 or whatever. But so for exact words, yes, you'd want, but if you're actually going to direct the reader potentially to the place in the book, you do need the page number. So then it's a balancing of, within theological biblical studies writing, we tend to want more detail. So I know that's why previously when we were part of the Brisbane College of Theology, they banned APA, which I thought was a bit cruel, because they took the view that just referencing a title and year doesn't actually demonstrate the student has used the book, and the occasional theological student is tempted to cut a corner here and there and not bother to find the reference. But so what you're doing is it was quite correct in terms of APA.
If there's a key tenet or idea, which our essay hinges on, that we've got.
This is reasonably fine-grained argumentation, so I think it's helpful. But thanks for. You've also. I tend to use Chicago. I don't use APA very often, so I'd forgotten that that's the case.
No, thank you. I just was just checking that I hadn't missed it.
And
So, Greg, are you talking about in-text references, putting a page reference in there with the APA?
Yep. So. No, correct. So if you're using APA, you will not have a bibliography. You'll have a reference list. Okay, a few people. Again, this is OCD square theology, but there are different protocols for different referencing systems. So if you're going to use one, use it correctly is the idea. Okay. So now the nuance, and see, across Charles Sturt generally, APA is the default style. But in theology, and also in a couple of the humanities schools, we still have a hankering for proper referencing, which means Chicago, okay, because we're traditionalists, like our lecturers have PhDs. No, sorry, that's not fair. So it is interesting that generally speaking in Charles Sturt, and probably in most other units, APA is the norm, and it's convenient, it's quick, and it does the job. There is still capacity to use the occasional footnote, even if you're using APA. If there's a URL or something you need to put in, you can put it as a footnote or something. If you're using Chicago, then you'll use footnotes or endnotes, and you'll have a bibliography at the end. And then the footnoting will be more specific in terms of page numbering. With the in-text referencing, the APA system, the preference would be to have as much detail as possible.
So you'd be fine for it to have the page numbers, even though that's not strict APA.
Yeah, because we're actually we're not giving a conference paper, we're actually writing a more argued piece, and we're actually needing to demonstrate where that idea comes from as well as the actual words. Because in theory, I should be able to pick up your essay and go to the book and see where it came from. Now, I only do that if I start reading the same paragraph in more than one essay, okay, in which case I go to Google, all right, or if I know how somebody speaks and I get a particularly fine piece of writing and I think, it doesn't sound like that student. I know that student, and they don't ever articulate themselves in that way. Do a quick Google search and I find the essay or the article or the web page from which said paragraph came. At which point Eve knows what's happened because the dynamics around the dining table change, and I go on this scavenger hunt for the next 2 hours finding all the plagiarized elements in that essay. So I just become feral. Okay. So yeah, so we will err on the side of over-referencing rather than under-referencing, but that's okay. Yeah. All right, so moving into wisdom and apocalyptic type literature. Okay. So I want to focus initially on wisdom literature, and then I want to segue across to apocalyptic literature. And I really want to do this, the strategy I want to use is by going through the three worlds and using that as a kind of a algorithm for what we're doing. Take that up to full screen. Okay. Now I have just these two documents that I used for the last session and for this session. I've just saved them as PDFs and added them back onto the Moodle site because Jeff had mentioned he wasn't able to get beyond a certain point in the page for some reason, so I've just saved them as PDFs and loaded them back up that way. So they'll be, when you do get the internet back, they'll be accessible that way as well. So as I've sort of indicated earlier, I would approach the question of the more poetic literature, the wisdom literature, and the apocalyptic literature. I don't see them as unrelated domains of ancient Judean society. Okay, my hunch is, and I think this is borne out by some of the studies, but my working assumption is that the kind of people that were able to generate and use the Psalms or the Song of Solomon or whatever are the same people who are generating and using and being shaped by the wisdom literature, and they're also the same people who are creating apocalyptic literature. Okay, now traditionally wisdom and apocalyptic have been seen as very different genre, and in some ways they are, but there are a whole lot of overlaps between the content and the form of wisdom and apocalyptic, which suggests to me they're the same bunch of people, and none of them are the farmers and the fishermen. Okay, and it's also the other factor that bear in mind here is that all of these texts, until we get to the texts which only exist in the Septuagint, okay, but all of these texts are being composed and transmitted in Hebrew at a time when that is not the everyday language in the street. Okay, that's the same point but a slightly different spin on it from the comment earlier about Ezra and Nehemiah publishing the Torah in Hebrew but needing to have an Aramaic translation because nobody could actually understand it. So And then, of course, inevitably, some of this literature gets translated into Greek, because that is the wider language, that's the international language once we moved into the Hellenistic and Roman periods. And then some of the language actually gets written in Greek rather than translated into Greek. Okay, so this is all part of a socialization, culturalization, or enculturalization process as the Jewish community, to varying degrees, assimilates. And I'm still playing with the theme of assimilation and resistance. And it's interesting to look, even in some of the more reactionary, conservative elements of Second Temple Jewish society, both Persian and Greek terms are coming into use in Hebrew documents, because this is the culture they're in. Okay, so that we get that sort of influence coming through. Okay, so in terms of the world behind the wisdom literature, I mean the texts we're dealing with, of course, are famously texts like Job, texts like Proverbs, texts like Ecclesiastes or Kohelet. To a certain extent, Song of Songs, Song of Solomon will be seen as a wisdom text. And then we're moving across into things like the Wisdom of Solomon and Ben Sira or Ecclesiasticus within the Apocrypha. So there's a set of 6 or 7 major texts which are easily identified as kind of wisdom literature. And as a number of you have noted in the essays that were handed in on wisdom literature is not so much a genre as a focus, a perspective. Because a wisdom writer will use various genres in order to explore their tongue. So they will use proverbs, they will use stories, parables, they will use poetry and so on. Okay, they will even use lists and so on. But there's something about wisdom literature which is more in its focus and in the kind of resolution of the assimilation resistance dynamic which I see flowing through all of this. Okay. So in terms of that set of literature, we've basically got the same dynamics in terms of textual criticism as we've seen for the other biblical texts. Our earliest complete Hebrew Bible codex is still going to be the Leningrad Codex from around the 10th century, from around about 1000 CE. The Aleppo Codex will give us 100 years or 150 years earlier. But fortunately for us, as of 1948, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, and the Dead Sea Scrolls represents something like a time cap. In this respect, represents something like a time capsule. It's not the complete Bible, as in every single page of every single book, but it's at least a couple of paragraphs out of every part of the Old Testament except for Esther and the Song of Songs. So that's and in some cases multiple copies, like the Psalms and Isaiah and Deuteronomy, multiple copies of those books. Okay, so it's just a fantastic treasure in terms of the history of the textual material going into the Bible. And not only the text, but of course, as we'll come back to after the break, the Dead Sea Scrolls also show us how these books were being used in the 2nd century and the 1st century prior to the Common Era. So we get an insight into the reception history of these books, not simply the textual history. Okay? So it's one thing to know the words that are on the page, it's another thing to know how the words on the page have shaped a community. And that's in some ways a more important question, although the other is primary. Okay? The other question, I've touched on this already in a sense with the textual material, is not only what shape and what evidence do we have for these books existing at certain times and how good is the quality of the manuscript evidence, but what are the languages that are going on here? And what we are seeing, as I said, is majority of these texts generated in Hebrew, all of them eventually being translated into Greek, some of them only being composed in Greek and not in Hebrew, and in the case of Daniel, a book which is a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic before being translated into Greek. And that's unusual. It's not the only bit of the Old Testament that uses Aramaic, but it's the most substantial bit of the Old Testament which is in Aramaic. Okay, so and it's not that, and the book of Daniel roughly divides into a set of stories in the first 6 chapters and a set of apocalyptic visions and prayers in the second half, and it's not that the first half is Hebrew and the second half is Aramaic. Okay, the language changes part way through to Aramaic and then it changes back to Hebrew before the end. So the difference in language does not correlate to the difference in content in the book of Daniel, which makes Daniel an even more interesting, puzzling thing. Okay, very complex textual and linguistic history going on there. But clearly in the case of the wisdom literature and certainly the apocalyptic literature, we're more and more moving into a world which is dominated by Greek power, which of course comes down to the Seleucids and the Ptolemies after the death of Alexander. And all of that will be equally true for apocalyptic literature as it is for wisdom literature, except the names of the books will change. Okay. So we'll come to apocalyptic in due course. So this, the particular challenge, I guess, in terms of the world behind the text for the wisdom literature is trying to imagine the social location for the sort of people writing these books. Where are they coming from? What's their function in society? Okay. To what extent are there what we would call schools in the ancient world? Now we have to go back before the Industrial Revolution, because our sense of school is basically a factory generating workers with literacy. Okay, that's what schools are about. We don't like to tell people that, but that's one of them. That's how we got kids sitting in desks working on essential information. So how did schooling take place before the factory model of education? Before we put them in barns and like battery hens and taught them how to sit up straight and have clean fingernails and know their numbers off by heart and so on. So how did you school somebody before school became a mass production of education? Okay, what's from your sense of history and social history?
Like an apprentice.
In terms of skills, people were apprenticed. Yep. Yeah, so you shadowed and learned a craft by working with somebody. Yep. So that's the sort of technical education sector in the pre-industrial era. Sorry.
Family community.
So I missed the
Family community.
family community. Yep. And I guess where my head is going is that the families and parts of the community which has less access to property and wealth and power are less likely to have a need for education or schooling, and it will be more craft and how to help a cow give birth to a calf, or be essential skills of being a farmer, a chippy, or whatever. But so people who are actually being schooled.
So it was my sense that it was only people who had time or wealth who would become followers of certain teachers.
Yeah, well, effectively, you either had a tutor, you brought a tutor in, or you sent your son, probably, to a university. Okay, and so remember, the invention of universities is roughly the 12th century. Okay, so there's something going on around the end of so I guess prior to that, you probably sent them to the monastery. And so one of the locations for literacy in medieval Europe, prior to sort of modernity beginning to emerge, would have been the cloister, the monastic life. And that's also a location where there's a reason for being literate. Because you've got to read the services, you've got to be able to read the Psalms, you've got to be able to earn your living by being a copyist, a scribe who's making manuscripts and so on. So the monastic communities are centres for learning, centres for literacy, and they have a built-in process of novitiate and so on, where people are learning the crafts and skills and attitudes and so on of being a monk. Okay. So one social location was to send somebody into the church. Okay, because lay people weren't in the church, just clerics went into the church, okay, as their occupation, as their calling, as their life setting. But if you weren't sending into the church, you would either get in a tutor to educate your children, if you were wealthy enough, or you would send them to a place which had a reputation for teaching. And it was particular crafts, so that places like Oxford and Cambridge were the places where you sent people who were training to become, where they studied theology, law and medicine. They were the kind of things you studied there. Okay, you didn't do a communication degree or an education degree. Okay, so the university model was a much smaller university, and we're talking about roughly a 800-year history of universities in Western Europe. I think the first university is actually an Islamic university founded in the Middle East. It's a couple of hundred years earlier, and we forget that they were way ahead of us in lots of ways at one stage. So the model for schooling, and think back then to last year I was for a few days in Durham for the Society of Biblical Literature conference. They were celebrating, I think it was their 650th anniversary of their foundation as a university. Now, 650 years ago, it was like 2 people and 3 students. That was the university. Okay, now it's the town. They bought every building in the town, basically, and apart from the golf course at St Andrews, sorry, not Durham, but St Andrews University, was celebrating its 650 years. The town does education and golf. Has a 700-year old university, and it has I think the first golf course as well. Okay, now there are perhaps both elite diversions: going to university and learning to play golf. Okay, if you go back further, the centre for that sort of learning is going to be the monastic communities, and if you go back further, it's going to be the philosophical schools or the academic schools, centred around a particular teacher, whether it's Aristotle or Plato or Ben Sira or Hillel or Shammai or Gamaliel. You get figures who emerge and they attract a group of followers, and they basically, not necessarily in this order, but in effect they hang up their shingle and attract a clientele. So it's more like our recent model of how you might learn music, or how you might learn singing, or even dancing. Okay, somebody who's really good at it starts taking students, develops a dance school, a music school, does piano lessons, whatever, and it's not so much a formal education process, but it's mentoring, but it's not craft based. It's a particular area of knowledge and skill.
It's kind of a different kind of craft based.
Yeah.
Learning that way of thinking and speaking. And they're doing philosophy and rhetoric kind of things.
Yep. And so I think I missed the first word from what you were saying. What are you describing?
You were saying that these schools of philosophy weren't like a craft-based apprenticeship, but I think in some ways they were. But the craft was just an intellectual craft.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. And they were, and indeed, the essential crafts they would have been acquiring, or skills they would have been acquiring, were not simply literacy, but even how to make paper, how to choose good quality paper, the skill of writing. Okay, and these days the essential skills of surviving a Bachelor of Theology program are computer skills. Okay, if you're not into computers, you're not really going to graduate in theology, or indeed any other academic discipline, okay? Because all the information's online, the essays have to be word processed, submitted by email, blah blah blah. So it's just assumed, and we don't particularly teach it to you, although we do a little bit of that, but it's assumed that the students have or will acquire proficiency in those skills. Well, in the ancient world there were other literary skills, and it included how to select and sharpen a quill, how to make your own pens, how to manage the ink, how to manage the paper, how to preserve and store documents, all these kinds of tasks. And these were the tasks these were the skills you needed for employment. because you're probably not going to be paid to be a philosopher. But with your background in philosophy and your skill with documents, you might be employed by a wealthy person to manage their estate, or by a ruler to conduct some aspect of government business. Or if you're really pushed, at least you can sort of get into sort of competitive tendering to get the government contract to be the tax collector for your village and the immediate precinct, where you get to screw all your neighbours and pass on to the government the agreed price and keep the difference for yourself, which means you have a very lonely life in your community because nobody wants to invite you around for Thanksgiving dinner. So yeah, but these skill sets, so it's not just abstract philosophical education, it's acquiring an intellectual nimbleness, if you like, if that's a word, but it's also about becoming adept in the tradition and skilled in the practical aspects of managing information, what we would now call information processing. Okay? And it's a lot of the information will exist orally, but then you've got to be trained to know the tricks of oral tradition. How do you remember things, and so on. And certainly in the Hellenistic period, anybody who went to any level of formal schooling, and there were schools and a recognised curriculum for an elementary education program in the Hellenistic world. And there are ancient documents which describe the curriculum and the processes of schooling in the ancient world. So anybody who's able to participate in that process as a child growing up is themselves relatively privileged because they're having opportunities that other people of their cohort are not getting, and they're going to learn Homer off by heart because that's the core curriculum. Okay, and one of the assessment tasks was to do a Homer, to be able to perform original work in the voice and the genre of Homer. That demonstrated how well educated you were. Okay, so anybody writing any documents in Greek for the Jewish and Christian communities, that person has a Greek education and is immersed in Homer, because that's the core curriculum document for the ancient school in the Greek world, Greek-speaking world. Okay? So we shouldn't be surprised. In fact, we would expect that as we move from the conquest of Persia by Alexander, and then we move into the 3rd century and the 2nd century, the 1st century, that some of the Jewish documents that are coming out are beginning to seem more and more Hellenistic, more and more Homeric. Okay, and one of my colleagues from the Westar Institute Jesus Seminar, he's put out a number of books on what's called mimesis, M-I-M-E-S-I-S. It's Dennis R. MacDonald, and he's written a number of books on the influence of Homer on the Gospel of Mark, the influence of Homer on the Acts of the Apostles. Because by definition, anybody who's got enough Greek to write Mark or to write Luke Acts has studied Homer. And we've basically stopped studying Homer. Okay, and so we miss. I mean, this is something just in the last 50 years. Colleagues of mine who either had their initial education in England or who studied just a decade or so before me often did read Homer and the sort of Iliad and the Odyssey as part of their primary and secondary school education. So they have an advantage in a sense because they will pick up some of the intertextual references that many of us will not notice because we don't have that background. Okay, so the world of wisdom literature, because it's literature, it necessarily implies a literate class, and that requires a society which is sufficiently organised, structured and resourced to specialise so that some individuals do not walk around with the sheep, don't catch the fish, don't carry the bags of rocks and so on, but some of them get to stand there with a clipboard and count the men who are carrying the bags of rocks. Okay, they're the overseers, they're the supervisors, they're the scribes. And again, if we go back to Ezra, in the first part where it talks about who Ezra was, he's introduced as, Ezra, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven. Okay, it's not a bad business card. Scribe of the law of the God of heaven. And my half joking translation of that is Secretary of State for Jewish Affairs in the Persian administration. Okay, sorry?
Not Esther, Lord. She didn't actually be secretary. She
Sorry, talking about Esther? No, she became the king's consort. That's a rather different position most of the time. Okay. Different skill set? Probably. Different selection criteria for sure. Okay, yeah. So Ezra is the social location he's given. He's not described as a priest. He's described as a scribe, a learned person. And the area of his learning is the Torah, or the law of the God of heaven. Now, part of what's going on, there's a shift of influence, a shift of power from, if you like, the royal family and the priestly families to the literate families. Now, of course, the old families with traditional privilege are going to be in the first row of the literate classes. Okay, but the social locations where literacy is going to be valued will be in temple functioning and in government administration and in merchant activity, because you need to keep records and you need to count, you need to add up, you need to calculate the calendar and the dates and all that sort of stuff, and you need to keep lists of property and family sort of genealogies, who's entitled to what, and so on. So they're the kind of drivers for literacy. That's not the same as saying they're the drivers for wisdom, because the wisdom will often emerge from the non-literate layers of traditional culture, but some of that traditional wisdom is then going to be codified and go into written texts.
This is part of their coming to terms with there not being a superpower, and that they need to work out how to engage with other empires. Is that the shift from the priestliness to because I thought the priests were the literate ones
The social scientific data would suggest to us that in ancient agrarian empires, and even if you're no longer the empire, at least you're still part of an ancient agrarian empire if you're living in Palestine, religious holdings, the temple estates if you like, still represented a disproportionate amount of the wealth of the society, and the people who manage that wealth and protect and secure that wealth for their own enjoyment are going to invest in literacy and so on. Now, I think what's happening over through this period in terms of resistance and assimilation, one of the dynamics is who gets to be high priest and what's the role of the high priest, and how is that similar to or different from the role of the governor / prince / what we would call secular leader. Is there a secular leader in Second Temple Judaism, or is the high priest the de facto head of state? Okay.
if they're investing into literacy for the purpose of being merchants, then it suggests that it is the secular leader is becoming more powerful.
Yeah. Well, the merchant class in that kind of social stratification, which is Linsky's. By Lenski, this merchant class are the kind of the in a sense the free radical element in the otherwise fairly stratified situation, because basically the priests are not going to wander too far away from their temple, because that's where the facilities are. Okay, free food twice a day, all that sort of stuff. The other members of the retainer class, which will be things like scribes and so on, they're going to be basically occupied in the task to which they're assigned and so on. The rulers are into domination, conquest, negotiations. There's only a few of them anyway. And the people further down the pecking order really don't get to move out of their own valley. They just stay where they're born, die where they're born, and in between time they have babies and grow crops or whatever. And the retainers come along with their clipboards and say, that's for us, thank you very much. Now, the people that have a little bit of social mobility are the merchants. And the merchants get to travel, and the merchants are connected with a larger network, as are some of the other elite retainers. And the merchants bring back the goodies that the more powerful people want to play with. The special treats, the fine cloth, the different spices, the Arabian horses, whatever it happens to be. And they try to get rich in the process. There's a margin here, of course. And they take the risk of either the ship going down at sea or being taken by pirates or captured by bandits, So there's a risk factor to being a merchant. If they succeed and make a good living and become wealthy, there's no prestige in being a wealthy merchant. They actually had to buy into land and become landowners and part of the, in a sense, upper class. So they have this sort of they're very important to the functioning of the system, but nobody wants to be a wealthy merchant. If you become a wealthy merchant, you want to become a landowner, because the people with status are landowners. And of course most peasants don't own the land, or they're struggling to retain the traditional family plot they might have inherited. So there's a social dynamic, and unless you are able to buy your way up the system as a successful merchant, or maintain your place in the tread water furiously with your scribal skills in the upper level, the real risk was you're inevitably going to fall into debt and go down the pecking order and join the expendable class, where your life expectancy will be even shorter than it would otherwise be. Because life expectancy could be very short in the ruling class as well, okay, because of being taken out by rivals, including your father or your husband. Okay, it was vicious. It's not like today's politics. Totally different. Okay, so the social location for wisdom literature is going to be this kind of world where there are a certain number of people, many of them well-connected families, and some of them families where the family system has acquired enough wealth to begin moving into the more respectable circles. As I said, having money wasn't the issue, it was having land that made you respectable. That's what gave you status, okay? That's what gave you honour. So, and these are the people who are going to be engaging in education, okay? And sending their children to education, because they want them to have skills to use in the family business, or B, they want them to move into roles in society where those sort of skills will be valued. Okay. Now, if we could take perhaps a semi-familiar example of that, which is not Old Testament apocalyptic or wisdom, but take someone like Paul, Saul of Tarsus. Okay. So he's from the first 50 or 60 years of the first century CE. So he's still in the same period. He's from the Second Temple period. Okay, he's Jewish. He's clearly literate. So what's Paul's social situation? Well, he identifies as a Pharisee. A Pharisee is somebody who is very particular about their observance of Torah, but actually wants to see the kind of the ritual holiness dynamics of the temple translated into everyday life. Okay, so then they're not anti-temple, but they want to democratize the enjoyment of God's presence. So it's not just located in the temple; it's actually potentially experienced in the domestic space. Okay, it's not simply that Pharisees were scribes, but like other groups in Jewish society, you would expect high levels of scribal literacy levels amongst Pharisees, because that's actually pretty close to main game for them. Okay. Now, one of the real challenges in terms of Second Temple literature and early Christian literature is to try and identify any document as a Pharisaic document. Okay? We can't actually say for sure that any of the literature we're going to look at after lunch is written by a Pharisee, except for the letters of Paul. He doesn't count anymore because he's become a Christian. Okay, so because there wasn't a category called Christian in Paul's life. He was a Jew, he was a Pharisee, and was a Jesus person within his Jewish identity. He didn't change his religion from Judaism to Christianity. Okay? And he still identifies in Philippians as a Pharisee and as a Hebrew-speaking Hebrew, which again is part of the intellectual discipline of that kind of segment in Jewish society. But what do we know? What do we think we know about Paul? Not as much as we'd like to know, but one of the things we know about Paul is that he also had a craft. He was a tent maker. In other words, he had skills in working with presumably ship sails and other large heavy-duty cloth. And by exercising that craft, he was able to move around the diaspora communities and more or less sustain himself. And he also had access to a horizontal network of other people in the same craft. So your craft group became a social location. And it became a place where the people you drank with were the people who were in the same craft, like builders, painters, painters and dockers, whatever, that idea that you hang out with the people that do similar kind of work, because you all smell the same for starters. Okay? If a baker sits down with a guy who's a shepherd, the shepherd smells. He smells like a sheep. Okay? If a shepherd sits down with a shepherd, there's no funny aroma in this room until the baker comes in. He's all covered in flour. So, there are all kinds of low-level, usually below conscious reflection where the stuff we do most of the day affects who we eat with and who we live with and who we make babies with and so on. Okay? And it's very little to do with religion, and it's very little to do with philosophy of life. It's kind of networks. Okay? So Paul would be an example from the end of the second temple period of the same sort of dynamics we're going to see with the grandson of Ben Sira around about 180 of the before the Common Era. Okay, people in Paul's case, he says he was sent to study in the school of Gamaliel. So a respected figure with a reputation. So Paul's family from southern Turkey are wealthy enough in the diaspora to send their kid to Jerusalem to study at the feet of Gamaliel. Okay, so it's the images of a relatively small cohort of people being mentored and tutored by a respected scholar. Okay, and he's literate, although most of the time, if I'm reading Paul's letters correctly, he did not physically write the letters. Okay, so again, this takes us back into the technology of the ancient world. Some scribes will be really good at writing. Other scribes are really good at composing. Well, it's the same today. Some people are good at creating content, other people are good at publishing content. Technology has changed a bit, but there are people who write music and there are people who make money out of selling music and publishing and so on, and the same with text and film and other things. So almost certainly Paul could read, and he had enough skill with a pen that he could scratch out a few words. But it wouldn't be a pretty letter. It wouldn't be a nice document. So in one case he actually says, see with what large letters I'm writing my name. In other words, I'm not a skilled scribe. I can write Paulos, but I'd prefer to use Timothy or somebody to write it down for me. So you get different areas of specialization within this whole scribal kind of class. And so wisdom literature is going to be one kind of stream of literature coming out of this social location. So what are some of the characteristics of it? Let's go down to the actual world of the wisdom literature. As we've said, in terms of literary form, there's going to be very little there which is distinctive and unique. But the characteristics of the wisdom literature are the what it's seeking to achieve, the values it's calling on its readers to develop and to exhibit, and where it's sourcing its authority from, what it's appealing to. Okay? Why should you listen to me? What's the authority? Why are my words important? Is a kind of a question that's assumed in the wisdom literature. Now, in the case of the wisdom literature, as many of you know from the work you did on the recent essay, they tend not to appeal to the classic Jewish story. They don't talk about Abraham. They don't talk about Moses. They don't talk about the Exodus. Okay? They don't talk about the covenant. They don't talk about Torah. And they hardly ever mention what we would call prophetic traditions. Okay? It doesn't mean that they didn't know them, but they weren't the traditions which were shaping their agenda as they wrote the wisdom literature. Okay? So, as a result, this wisdom literature tends to look to us like it has very little in it which is distinctively Jewish. Because the classic Jewish formative story is not going to be what's driving the wisdom literature. So what is going to drive the wisdom literature is more what works. Okay? So like be happy, be successful, that section of the bookshop. That's where you put the wisdom literature. Not so much the religious category, but the self-help kind of category. Okay? And wisdom is going to be what works well if you're trying to survive in your employment with a powerful person. Okay? And what works well in terms of what we observe going on in nature. Okay? In terms of productive. What are the kinds of wisdom insights about how to survive and do reasonably well. Okay? And so it's issues like, well, get up early, don't stay up late at night and sleep in the morning, get up early, go to work, plant the seeds, do the hard yards, put the effort in up front, wait for the rewards to come down the track. Okay? In other words, one way of paraphrasing that is, don't assume privilege, but assume that if you put the effort in, there will be a worthwhile outcome. Now, and that would be a professional standards kind of agenda, which you could imagine would be important to give to the kind of young men that are being channeled through the formative process of the rudimentary schooling system in ancient Jerusalem, with the idea of either working in the temple or working for the Hasmonean dynasty or being involved in some way for the Ptolemaic, Seleucid or Roman administration. Okay? Don't presume privilege is sort of a subtext going through a lot of that practical wisdom. Okay? It's probably one of the subtexts in the formation process for clergy as well. Don't presume privilege. There's something else I was going to say related directly to that, but it's just slipped out of my mind. It's okay. Oh, I was just going to note again. Note the kind of characters where there are narrative elements in the wisdom literature. Note the kind of characters that sort of play into this sort of agenda. Okay, so someone like Daniel. Okay, not worrying about the details of the Daniel stories, but how is the character of Daniel represented? Well, he's healthy and he's smart and he's good looking and he lives by the rules and he prays 3 times a day and so on. So he's, they're all the kind of attributes of a good person who's got a bright future ahead of them, if you don't count being thrown into the lion's den. But it's okay because he got out of the lion's den. That's not meant to happen, of course. You're meant to not go into the lion's den because you stay out of trouble. And again, assimilation and resistance. What's the problem with Daniel? Well, he won't assimilate fully. He's assimilated a long way, but there comes a point where he will resist. And it's passive resistance. He just makes a point of saying his prayers, his illegal prayers, with the window wide open, instead of shutting the window and crossing himself 3 times and saying his prayers privately. Okay? So he's kind of in your face, and being in your face is not part of the recipe for success. Okay? Whereas staying out of trouble, not drawing too much attention, doing all the right stuff, generating the outcomes that the boss wants, they're elements in the recipe for success. Okay? And if that's sounding a little bit cynical, a little bit skeptical, that's maybe also part of the dynamics of the wisdom tradition. Okay? Because part of the wisdom tradition is they also know that it doesn't necessarily work. Not only does Daniel end up, at least momentarily, like overnight, that'll be a sleepless night, he ends up in the lion's den, but and people like Joseph, okay, and we don't tend to think of Joseph as the wisdom story, but Joseph is in many ways the archetypal young wisdom character. Okay, and he ends up in prison because he says no to the boss's wife. Okay, there's a whole social dynamic familiar to that cohort of people preparing for life in the public sector. Okay? So you could end up in prison because something has gone pear-shaped. No matter how good your education, no matter how well you're doing your job as the manager of Potiphar's estate, you can end up in prison. No matter how well you're doing your job within the Babylonian kingdom, you can end up cast into the fiery furnace or thrown into the lion's den. Okay? And of course, God will save you when that happens. Except she doesn't always save you when it happens. Okay? And because that's where books like the Book of Job come in and say, well, actually, it's not always the case that living a perfect life results in abundant blessing. Okay? Sometimes it goes totally pear-shaped. So within the wisdom tradition, there's not only the dynamic of follow these rules and you'll be okay, there's also the stand back and say, well, you do have to follow the rules, but it won't necessarily be okay. But you follow the rules anyway, because your own integrity has to be there. And there's a kind of, in the book of Job, there's this sophisticated sense, and maybe Ecclesiastes as well, there's this sophisticated sense that doing the right thing is not a formula for blessing. So why do the right thing? Okay. And these are the kinds of challenges and the kinds of issues which I think are deeply characteristic of the wisdom literature. Okay. All right. So let's come and keeping an eye on the time. Let's have a look at. Yep. Just reminding myself when the lunch break is. Let's have a look at at kind of our reception of this literature. I think we can see straight away the wisdom literature is material in the Bible which is actually going to appeal pretty well to our kind of audience. Okay, this is not a bit of the Bible with all the pre-packaged answers, even though at times it seems in Proverbs and so on it seems like that. Okay, when we take the wisdom literature as a canonical collection, the sort of nuanced and ambiguous nature of reality is being acknowledged. It's not just do the right thing, God will bless you, do the wrong thing, you'll be in trouble. Okay? And if you find yourself thrown in the lion's den, God won't necessarily get you out of trouble. Okay? Now, one of the scenes along the line, also in the book of Daniel, which of course is apocalyptic, but I keep talking about it in wisdom, in the scene of the fiery furnace. Okay, you never know when you're going to say something in a little talk, a chapel talk or something, and it's going to stick in some kid's head. Okay, so one of my very first experiences in my first year at Bible college, which was also my first year after year 12, one of the devotional comments that came from a chapel service at that stage was somebody using the story of the fiery furnace, three men in the fiery furnace. Okay, pointing out that in that story, the three guys say to the king, our God is able to rescue us from your hand, O Nebuchadnezzar. But even if he doesn't, we will not obey your law. Okay, a very significant but in that story. Okay, we think God is able to look after us, but whether God is going to look after us or not, we're going to maintain our own integrity. Wow. Yeah? That's powerful. My reading of stuff, my experience of stuff, that's powerful text. Okay? And again, it goes back to this fault line, this dynamic between assimilation and resistance. Now, of course, in that story, it has a happy ending. Okay? But it doesn't always. And the people who were reading the book of Daniel and even generating the book of Daniel, if they're doing this around the time of the Maccabean crisis, that's when martyrdom actually becomes a serious dynamic for Jews. Okay? Until the time of the Maccabees, there really isn't such a thing as a martyr in the biblical tradition. There are people who get killed, but they get killed because they're on the wrong side of a battle, on the wrong side of a dynastic struggle, okay, or because they're Ammonites or Moabites or whatever. They're not killed because they worship Yahweh. Okay? But in the case of the Maccabean crisis, people are killed because they refuse to deny their faith and their identity as Jews, and they refuse to assimilate into the Seleucid Hellenistic power game. And so martyrdom becomes a real issue. So it's interesting, the book of Daniel has the martyrdom, the potential martyrdom of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and then it has the potential martyrdom of Daniel in the lion's den. Okay? You won't find that anywhere in any of the earlier parts of the Bible. Okay. Something else I was going to say about the wisdom. One of the things is we read wisdom literature, and we'll come back to some of the same questions with apocalyptic literature as well. Much as this literature might speak more directly to us, because it's not as anchored in the distinctive Jewish traditions. Okay, it addresses more general human dynamics. Okay. But even so, it is thoroughly patriarchal. You know, gender-based discrimination is just integral to the world of the wisdom literature. Okay, and so that is one of the points where, much as we might find this literature very accessible and very easy to use, it also tends to reinforce male privilege because it's coming out of the ancient culture of Jerusalem around about 200 or 300 BCE. And frankly, it wouldn't have been much different if it came out of, you know, Rome in the 10th century or London in the 19th century or Brisbane in the 20th century. Okay, gender-based privilege and marginalisation is a persistent part of the human experience. Okay. So that's going to be one of the dynamics as we read the text, and then it's fascinating then to see how the figure of Sophia, the feminized figure of wisdom, functions. Okay, this is basically a boy's world, and they're fantasizing about the perfect woman, who, if they follow her, she will guarantee their success. And if they follow the wrong woman, the strange woman, then they're in trouble. Okay, so again, there are, I think, significant issues going on in terms of the world of the text or the literature of the text, but also in terms of our reception of that text. Okay, and you know, so in many ways, my personal story, of course, as a privileged white male from an Anglo background, growing up in the 50s and 60s, I play really easily into the wisdom tradition. Doesn't mean I'm a wise man, but I mean I play very easily into those stereotypes. And it all fits. It's all very nice. And I could live by that wisdom and it would fit very well. But it would be very different if I was a person of colour or if I was a woman. Okay? Or if I was from a family which, because of its circumstances, had not been able to... I mean, I went to government schools all the way through, but we're still a family that valued education. What if I'd grown up in a family that just wanted me to get out and get a job and start working at the butcher's shop as soon as I'd finished year 9 or something? Okay, would have been a totally different story, most likely. Okay, so we start to bring those kind of the issues of our current context into that. Now, one of the interesting aspects of wisdom literature, I think, for readers today, is that wisdom literature is less focused on the wonderful acts of God in history, and more focused on getting your life in sync with the way the universe is working. And I think that's actually a theological reflex, which is potentially of great significance for the contemporary church. Okay? Are we going to defend to the last person the historicity of the mighty acts of God, in inverted commas, in the Old Testament, or are we going to say, well, let's not go to the wall over that stuff. Let's look at how we might envisage a new future, and let's look at how we might organise our lives personally, collectively, as church, as culture, so that we actually are not destroying the very basis of us being here, which is a more kind of eco-theological perspective. Okay. Not just what is good for the aspiring young male who wants to have a career in the public sector, but what's actually going to be good for Earth. What's going to be good for the garden, rather than what pleases the gardener. That's one thing, but what's actually good for the health of the garden? Because can the gardener be happy if the garden is not healthy? And so we start, and there's no covenant language there. It's thinking, it's doing a theological reflection on nature rather than a theological reflection on events of the past. We're still trying to work out how to act now. We're looking for wisdom, but wisdom literature is suggesting that we don't have to narrow our search within the explicitly religious and distinctive elements of our tradition. We can learn from the wider world as well. And it's also because wisdom literature is saying, don't let the theory become so hard that it doesn't deal with reality. And the book of Job is really good at making that point.
So Greg, where does the wisdom literature sit with modern Israel? And how do they perceive the wisdom literature in terms of...
Okay.
Well, because clearly the establishment of the state is based on the covenant. Well, I know it. You've explained other things historically, but there seems to be a philosophical understanding that the state of Israel is there because it's God-given, and yet what you're talking about is within the wisdom literature is a way that Israel could maybe better fit.
Yeah, well, that is one heck of a question. I might get back to you in 3 years or something. Keep coming to class. Let's leave it in terms of assimilation and resistance, because that might be an interesting way of tackling this. Part of the seed for Zionism, which was a secular Jewish movement, was actually a refusal to assimilate into European Christian secular society. And it's partly a reaction to the emergence of the nation state in European society in the 19th century. The unification of Italy in the 1870s, the unification of Germany, the idea that one people, one language, one land. Okay, the French had their country, the English had their country, the Germans needed to have their country. We'll worry about Austria later, but another thing. The Italians were unified, and so on. And the idea of a central nation state which was cohesive in terms of its ethnicity, its language, its religion. And so where do the Jews fit in that kind of empire, that kind of world? Well, they needed a country, they needed a land, they needed to be a nation state. So Zionism is partly about doing the European nation state on a piece of land that makes sense for the Jewish people and also serves the political agenda of the European powers at the time, namely Britain and France, to a lesser extent Germany, which was still just getting its act together, and what they all had in common was they didn't like the Russians and they didn't like the Turks. And if they could mess up Palestine, they could mess with both the Russians and the Turks, the Ottomans. Okay, so there are dynamics about being in a world of empires that are in conflict with each other. There are issues about assimilation and resistance, and the initial impetus for creating for the Jewish people going back to Palestine was the idea that they needed a homeland, and it was a form of resistance, but it was not a violent resistance, and it was a refusal to assimilate, but it was not initially an ethnic cleansing project. It was not a displacement project. It was more like Genesis 12 than Joshua. Okay, go and live amongst the people, be a blessing to them. Now, and maybe the big unresolved issues, which are going to sort themselves out somewhere or other in the next 50 or 100 years, are actually still about assimilation and resistance. As a Jewish left-wing activist, Jeff Halper is the chair of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolition. As he says, Israel has to become a Middle East country. It actually has to join the neighbourhood, which is getting to the issue of assimilation and resistance. Okay.
That seems to fit more easily with the wisdom literature than it does.
Yes, because covenant traditions and even prophecy traditions and even apocalyptic traditions, which we may run out of time to talk about, and that's okay, are more about distinctive promises to the chosen people, meaning us, of course. It's always about us. The wisdom tradition is more about making sense of the bigger picture in which we're living and not emphasising the distinctives, but almost celebrating the commonalities. And so it's the other side of the coin in some ways. And it's more inclined towards assimilation than it is to resistance. Now, there can still be strategies of resistance, and I think Apocalyptic is an example of that. And in the case of wisdom literature, by the time you get to Ecclesiasticus, or the Ben Sira, I think it's around about chapter 24 or thereabouts, Lady Wisdom is the incarnation of the Torah. Okay, so they brought the Torah back home, and they've actually converged. The Torah dominance within Second Temple Judaism has married into the wisdom tradition, and so Lady Wisdom is Torah. Okay, and so it's no longer a case of you're going to study Torah or follow wisdom. If you follow wisdom, you will discover Torah. If you study Torah, you will be following wisdom. So there's a closing of the circle there. And again, that's a form of resistance, but it's very gentle, very low-level cultural resistance, rather than. And the rediscovery of Hebrew and the insistence on Hebrew in coins from the Hasmonean dynasty and so on is again a resistance, cultural resistance. Again, assimilation and resistance. Modern Hebrew, or Israeli Hebrew, or Israeli as some people now call it, is of course a combination of biblical Hebrew, Yiddish and Arabic. And so you get assimilation and resistance with the way language is working there. Now, in terms, so the prophetic traditions and the Torah traditions, which are more about promise and blessing, they tend to play into aspirations to have the land and even to have exclusive possession of the land. The wisdom tradition would, I guess, be more like saying, well, we're actually in a real world here, and while God might be in control, she seems to be on holidays, and we've just got to make the best of it until God comes back. And so maybe we better cut some sort of deal with our neighbours, or maybe we should stop beating up our neighbours if they're actually in the same country and town as us. Now that would be, I guess the wisdom agenda does not play to the current political and nationalist aspirations of most Israelis. That's not to say it's missing from their tradition, but it's not the most powerful, evocative part of the tradition for the existential situation they perceive themselves to be in. And so it gets back again to assimilation resistance. They're not wanting to be assimilated. That's definitely what Israel is about. They don't want to become Europeans, and actually they don't want to become Arabs either. So they're not going to assimilate. But then, without sustaining or maintaining very expensive and dehumanizing processes of control and occupation and subjugation and ethnic cleansing and so on, how do they maintain their identity if they're not going to assimilate? Now again, same guy, Jeff Halper, is obviously one of my friends, one of my heroes. He talks about there are three goals that modern Israel is trying to achieve. It wants to be Jewish, it wants to be democratic, and it wants to control the land. And they can have two of the three. But which two will it be? Okay? And that's, to me, it's just another way of getting into the issues about identity, assimilation, resistance. And the wisdom literature and apocalyptic literature are very much about, I think, those issues, those dynamics. And I hope a wisdom tradition prevails and not an apocalypse. Because we don't need any more apocalypse. Got enough apocalypse. Okay, just briefly, we've got about 15 minutes or so left, so let me just try and segue across to apocalyptic. For reasons I won't go into in great detail, but I think apocalyptic literature belongs in the same general context as the Kethubim more generally and the wisdom literature in particular. The only people that can write apocalyptic literature are people that can write, people that are educated. And a one-line summary of apocalyptic is it's first century science fiction. Okay? And a lot of modern science fiction is 21st century apocalyptic. And it used to drive my daughters nuts. We'd be watching things like Apocalypse Now or The Day After or whatever, and I'd be identifying the characters from ancient Jewish apocalyptic texts that are coming on the screen, and they're going, "Oh, Dad, cut it out." That's not... But, just watch the movie, exactly. Stop ruining the movie. But look at that's the... Okay, so there's something going on there. Now, sure, the modern apocalyptic and post-apocalypse utopian sort of films are not written out of the same or even a similar social context as 1st and 2nd century Jews were writing out of. Except the general despair, the underlying despair that we're heading for a really nasty collapse or a nasty apocalyptic catastrophe with nuclear war or whatever. And that rears its head from time to time. So what the apocalyptic writers are doing, I think they have to come out of the world of the temple, of the priesthood and the scribal class, because that's where we're going to find literacy, that's where we're going to find the theological traditions, and that's where we're going to find the knowledge, the scientific knowledge of the time, which is being deployed as they construct these texts. Okay? So in that sense, they're ancient science fiction. They're using the science, the best knowledge of the natural world known to the scholars of their time. So they're not grumpy old men living in a shack in the mountains in California waiting for the nuclear bomb to be dropped. They're actually mainstream people embedded in the society, but they're more focused on issues of resistance than on issues of assimilation. And they have totally despaired of any capacity of the present political system to fix the problem. Okay? So they're not backing the high priest, they're not backing the Hasmonean king, they're not even necessarily joining the Maccabean rebellion. Okay, one of the arguments is that the book of Daniel comes out of the Maccabean rebellion, but is actually arguing against armed resistance and saying, guys, just wait. God will come. God will fix it. There's no point in rebellion. Okay? However, a lot of the time apocalyptic scenarios inspire people to try and fast-track the end of the world by starting the war. And we see that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The scroll of the wars of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. Read the text. That's an interesting title. They believe that they were preparing for the great final battle Okay, and there's a script for how the battle's going to run. Unfortunately, the Roman 10th Legion didn't follow the script, and the Essene soldiers were decimated, and the Romans won. And it seems to happen over and over again over the last 2,000 years. So hence apocalyptic. Apocalyptic is what happens to prophetic hopes for the future when there is no hope of getting there in the near future by our own efforts. And so you speculate on what God is doing about it, what God's package is, what God's plan is. And of course you express this by imagining that God has known all along what's got to happen. And actually God told all this to Enoch. Or God told all this to Daniel. Or God told all this to whoever your favourite Old Testament character was. Okay? And I just happen to have a copy of his memoirs where it's all laid out. And it's incredibly accurate up until today. And then it gets a bit fuzzy because actually I don't know the future. Okay, so apocalyptic literature, like the book of Daniel, will be quite detailed in terms of sort of dynastic and imperial machinations until you get to roughly 160 BCE, at which time the book of Daniel becomes very vague, because that's presumably the time of the author. Okay. Now, there are certain characteristics of this literature. Some of them are noted in the notes that you'll be able to grab off the website. Okay, no, it's in a different text. But anyway, includes things like there tends to be a seer, S-E-E-R, prophet or a seer. He will typically be a character of great antiquity, who's revered because of the antiquity. And indeed, Daniel is one such figure, okay, as is Job. Because we primarily encounter Daniel in the book of Daniel, we think of Daniel as a figure from the end of the Old Testament. But actually Daniel, Noah and Job are three legendary figures from the mythical past. And we see that in Ezekiel 14, where there's this text going on that says, where the prophet says, even if those three great men were in the city, Noah, Job and Daniel, I would still not spare the city. Hang on. Daniel's not supposed to be here yet. Nobody knows where Job belongs, and Noah, of course, belongs right back at the story. So what we appear to be dealing with are three characters who were famed for their virtue in the time of the prophet Ezekiel. Okay, now there's no way that a Babylonian Daniel will be known to the prophet Ezekiel. So Daniel, the character Daniel, with his reputation, has to be a much more ancient tradition, along with Job, along with Noah. So, and they're all, if you think about it, Noah, Job and Daniel are all about destruction. They all have elements of destruction in them. Noah, it's the destruction of the physical world because of evil, and he and his immediate family survive. I believe the current film version is slightly different, but I haven't got to see it yet. Job is also a story about destruction. It's the destruction of his immediate family. All the people that matter to him get taken out. But there's a recovery, there's a future. Despite the destruction, he doesn't get the same kids back, he gets another bunch of teenage daughters to live through. That's a blessing, apparently. Okay? So the last chapter of Job is a rather different kind of blessing and re-establishment. In the case of the book of Daniel, they're being cast into the furnace, they're being cast into the lion's den, they're being persecuted and so on. They will die for their faith, but they will rise. God will raise them up and they will shine like the stars in the heaven. And there, for the very first time in the Old Testament, we get not only the idea of martyrdom, but the idea of personal resurrection. Okay?
Like the destruction of Daniel's destruction is
Daniel himself survives in those early stories, but the stories of Daniel are about what appears to be destruction and miraculous survival. Like, you don't go into a lion's den and emerge in one piece in the morning. Daniel does. That's a kind of resurrection story. You don't go into the fiery furnace, which is so hot that even the soldiers that are carrying you burn to death while they're trying to throw you into the furnace. And when your king lets you out, not only are you unharmed, you don't even smell smoky. Wow, I mean, let's amp the miracles up a bit. And because by the end of Daniel, when you go to the last few chapters, and particularly chapter 12, those who die for their faith, it's only the martyrs, but the martyrs will rise like the stars and join the stars. And there are still many people who, when they're arranging a funeral, want to think about their deceased as becoming one of the stars. Kind of, touchy-feely kind of idea. So this deep despair that we can make a difference, and this absolute confidence that God's got it under control. He's revealed it to a figure from the past, be it Daniel, Enoch, Noah, Job, whoever, and it's all coming to pass right now. Nobody writes Apocalyptic to make sense in 500 years' time. Okay? You're writing Apocalyptic because you've got a message for your own contemporaries. Okay? Just like the prophets in the Old Testament. Their words were picked up 500, 700 years later and continued to be meaningful, but they weren't addressing that audience back in the 8th century. They were addressing their immediate contemporaries and perhaps the next generation who might hear about what happened. The other thing about Apocalyptic, one of the things about Apocalyptic is that the act of revelation, which is what apocalyptus means, because it means uncovering or revealing, the act of revelation will either involve a vision or a journey. You'll either see a vision of an angel, or the angel will pick you up and take you on a journey through all the storehouses of heaven, where you'll see where God stores the snow and the ice and the lightning and all the rest. That's the science fiction sort of stuff, okay?
So that notion of audience and purpose of apocalyptic literature in the Old Testament is, being for the audience now and in their particular time and context. Does that also apply to the New Testament apocalyptic?
Yes. So whoever wrote the Apocalypse, or the book of John, Revelation of John, they were not thinking, now this stuff is really going to be very important in around about the year 2015. They were thinking they had something to say to their contemporaries. And of course, the book keeps getting reinterpreted every few hundred years, because obviously it didn't mean that, because it hasn't happened. It must mean this, maybe. Or maybe it's not meant to be taken literally when it's functioning as sacred literature. Maybe it's meant to set up stereotypes, archetypes at least. And the archetypes, that's my theme for today, is about assimilation and resistance. And that's certainly what we get in the book of Revelation. Okay? Now, one of the differences between Jewish apocalyptic and what follows in Christian apocalyptic is that in Christian apocalyptic, Jesus is the answer. Okay? The hero of a Christian apocalypse is always Jesus. And guess what? The hero of a Jewish apocalypse is never Jesus. That's not a surprise if we stop and think about it, okay? So who are the heroes in the book, in the Jewish apocalypses? They tend to be angels, like Michael the archangel, who defeats Satan. And we get a bit of that in Revelation chapter 12, okay? So Michael is the rider on the white horse who destroys the dragon, also known as St. George and the dragon, also recycled as Jesus on the white horse in the book of Revelation as the great conqueror. Okay, so this is ancient mythic material being recycled. And again, in terms of assimilation and resistance, how do you know a Christian house in Israel? It has a plaque of St. George and the dragon above the front door. We will destroy you. A little bit of resistance going on there. Okay, or you drive into the village of Fasuto, one of the 3 Christian villages left in Israel, which are entirely Christian. And as you drive in the front entrance of the village, there's a large statue of Elijah, sword above his head, hand around the throat of the prophet of Baal, which was at his feet and about to slit his throat. And I guess you're about to tell me you find them in all through the villages of southern Lebanon as well. No?
You showed us pictures of that.
Oh, you're right. Okay, you've seen it. Yeah, because in the Maronite and Melkite villages of northern Israel, southern Lebanon, that's the kind of statue you have at the entrance to the village. And it says something to your Muslim neighbours. Okay? We do real close shaves here. Okay, so but it's about assimilation and resistance, drawing boundaries. And apocalyptic is about resistance, but it's about giving hope to resist in the meantime. And it's filled with you exaggerate the terrible punishment which God is going to inflict on your opponents, not because you literally think that's what God is going to do to your opponents, because you want to emphasize the positive hope value of that message. And so by imagining the worst possible, boy, are you guys going to get it when Jesus turns up, you're strengthening your own resolve to resist in the meantime. Where it becomes really scary, of course, is when people think we can contribute to the coming of the apocalypse, in which case we probably can, but we may not survive it. Okay, if we try to force the apocalypse, we may just fall victim to the violence that we've set loose. So an apocalyptic literature, it turns out, is not unique to Jewish tradition. It's not unique to Christianity. Apocalyptic literature is a phenomenon found across all religious traditions, and it's the literature of the marginalized, but it is literature, so it has to be works created by literate but marginal. It's not the literature of the peasants, it's the literature of the elite, those who think they should be in charge of the black jelly bean bottle, and they're not, but one day they will be. And look out when we get the black jelly beans. Boy, you guys going to miss out. Okay, so it's that kind of structural dynamic going on. So it is fundamentally about hope, and it's about motivation to resist, even, if need be, martyrdom, which of course is the ultimate form of resistance. So I would suggest the ultimate form of resistance is not, I will attack you and drive you out, because actually I don't feel powerful enough to do that. But the ultimate form of resistance is to allow myself to be killed and say, you don't own any of me. Okay? I'll go to the next life, hopefully. Okay? So apocalyptic is vivid, scary, dangerous stuff. It's not the kind of literature which is enjoyed by comfortable people, which probably explains why it doesn't play really big in an Anglican congregation. Okay? But it is the kind of theology that plays into more marginalised and challenged sectors of community. And so, for instance, it has been very popular amongst black Americans as they've dealt with social discrimination. They've used the metaphors out of the Old Testament, including apocalyptic stuff. It's also, I think, very powerful for some of the socially challenged white underclasses in the US and probably in Australia as a way of projecting their own experience of disadvantage and lack of opportunity, blaming another group and invoking a day of when it's all going to turn around. Okay? So there are all those sort of dynamics in there as well.